You're listening to the Talking Headways Podcast Network. Hey there. Your ears are not deceiving you again. This is our Centennial music celebrating making it to another 100 episodes. This is episode 400 of the Talking Headways Podcast. We're here. We made it. We're having some fun. 400 episodes online and over 500 if you add in all the Monday shows. Very exciting stuff. We couldn't have gotten here without you. All the way to 400 episodes. Thank you, listeners, for being here. Really appreciate it. Especially our wonderful Patreon supporters. You guys are awesome. Keep the show going. Amazing. Also, big thanks to Sophia Lee for editing the show through the pandemic. And to all of our wonderful guests, we appreciate that you come on and share all of your knowledge with us. It's really amazing that we get to learn so much from you. This episode, I wanted to look back on some fun conversations. Obviously, we can't fit 400 episodes into one, but we can take a small listen back and remember some of the interesting conversations that we had. I hope folks enjoy it and hang out for, another 100 episodes. Keep listening to the show. I'm really proud of Talking Headways and what we've been able to do over 400 episodes. And I'm really looking forward to that 500th episode of Talking Headways. I hope we really get there. I'm sure we will. 500, 400, 300, 200, 100. And go back to listen to those other 100 and 200 episode shows. Those are fun. But first, let's just bask in this fun music. Thanks, everybody, for joining us. This is Talking Headways episode number 400. We're going to go back in time and take a look and listen to some of the episodes that we've had in the past. Obviously, we can't get to all of them, as I mentioned before, but we're going to try and see a few of them anyways. We're going to probably do about 13 little clips, about 5 to 6 minutes long each. Some really cool answers for some questions that I asked. I had to cut down the list. I went through, all the episodes that we've had, and there's so many good ones. I mean, all of them are good in their own ways, but there's so many ones that I really wanted to add in, and I just couldn't because we didn't have time. Maybe we'll put it on 500, or maybe we'll do maybe 450. We'll go back and do some more, searching back in time and looking at the old episodes. But I really appreciate everybody for listening. It's really amazing that you guys come back each week and listen to the podcast. The listenership is really great, and I really do appreciate it. So with that being said, I would go and do a couple of advertisements, but I think that the main thing is, get your scarves, go to theoverheadwire.com, sign up for the newsletter, go to patreon.com/theoverheadwire, check us out on bookshop.org. We've just created a new t-shirt on TeePublic, Cars or Cholesterol. Make sure you go and check that out. Go to bit.ly /Cars Are Cholesterol, and you'll find that. And just lots of really cool stuff we've done over the years. It's crazy that we've done so many things. The audiobook of Town Planning and Practice. So check those out if you get a chance. I'm not going to go into the long spiel as usual. But again, thanks to Patreon supporters. Thanks to the listeners. Thanks everybody for making it to 400 episodes. We really appreciate it. And I guess, let's just get started. Let's go. 400 episodes. Thanks so much. Okay, in this first clip, we're going back all the way to episode 177. Jarrett Walker talks about home. You mentioned the word feelings. That comes up a lot in your discussions. How does that tint how people see things, their feelings?
Well, everybody is, to some extent, a mass of fear and desire, and has basic anxieties and needs that are entirely what you expect of us as organisms. We need a sense of home. We are protective of home. NIMBYism is the most understandable instinct. It is the bird driving predators away from the nest. It is protecting home. We have a desire to be free, which is in tension with the desire for belonging. We want to feel free to do whatever we want, but we also want some sort of structure that helps us understand what we should want. One of the things that I find helpful is to understand that there are two opposite ways that human beings feel certain. And there is the certainty there is a deep emotional certainty that tends to arise from very strong feeling. You can go to peak experiences, positive and negative, and understand that when you're having a peak experience, it's like you're being taken out of ordinary space and time and into some special place, right? Heights of sexual excitement, heights of various other kinds of adrenaline-producing events, and also negative sensations like extreme pain tend to destroy your ability, tend to take you away from the ability to sort of perceive your world and in space and time kind of the way it really is. In fact, the word peak experience, the metaphor is a mountaintop, and the idea is that you've been taken out of the everyday plane in which we live, which is the metaphor is that plane is sort of ordinary space and time. And so it's easy when you're motivated by peak experiences or motivated by strong emotions, either ecstatic or agonizing feelings, that gives you a strong sense of certainty. We form certainty out of strong emotions. But there's this other kind of certainty, and that's the certainty we have about how physical space works. We know that an adult elephant will not fit in a wine glass. We know that so well that we don't need to do the experiment. And we know all of this about how ordinary physical space works. There are aspects of how reality works that are not going to change in response to anybody's opinion about them. And a lot of what I'm always doing is just bringing the conversation back to that, understanding that we can have all the ideals and fears and hopes and anxieties and everything else that we want that play out in our politics, but we have to share the same space, and there are facts about space. And in cities in particular, the defining feature of a city, and the reason these issues come up first in a city, is that a city is a place where there is not much space per person. So that need to think about space and use space carefully is a uniquely urban problem. And much of what we know about public transit is just facts about space, right? Trying to make transit micro when the essence of how transit succeeds is to carry lots of people on one vehicle is just a fundamental contradiction. And the fact that all my life people have been asking me, couldn't you run smaller vehicles? And all my life people have been telling transit agencies they should run smaller vehicles, and we've seen no end of, frankly, fairly disastrous experiments with, trying to run little vans or whatever as part of the transit system. But people will just never stop asking us this. The need to believe that something smaller and cuter and more scaled to their neighborhood has to be more efficient is so impossible to dispel with data or information that I have to understand that there's something deeper going on there about a desire to believe that I can have a sustainable, environmentally friendly, efficient transit system that takes me to my door, and you can't. It's physically impossible.
Where does that come from? Where does that feeling that you need a smaller vehicle, that you need a cutesy, it doesn't have to be cutesy, but just like a van or
Well, I think this takes us over into NIMBYism, doesn't it? That question is really our gateway into how the whole small vehicle conversation in transit relates to the protect our neighborhoods conversation in land use. The low-density neighborhood that is protective of its low density is going to feel threatened by something that treats it as though it's a high-density neighborhood, like a big vehicle. And I think all that conversation you get about appropriate scale, these big buses lumbering down our streets. We had a great one recently, a campaign against a bus rapid transit line in Eugene, whose only effect on this neighborhood was that we were going to use 60-foot articulated buses instead of 40-foot standard buses. But this neighborhood threw up an enormous campaign about the transit agency dividing our neighborhood, walling off our neighborhood, because we were going to run buses through it that were 20 feet longer than the buses that are there now. People get very irrational about this, and I understand it only by understanding that this is essentially the transportation equivalent of the debate about density and urban form and protecting our neighborhoods, and the conflict between what you would understand as protecting your neighborhood, protecting your quality of life, the way that is in direct conflict with providing places where everyone can live so that your barista doesn't have to commute 40 miles to work. It's the same conversation. And ultimately, it just comes down to home. It comes down to how everyone feels about home and the defensive emotions that many people have about home. It's a stage of life thing too. I think younger people are more used to the concept of home being provisional. Oh, I have an apartment, I move every couple of years. Once you have a family, home feels different. And because home becomes a spatial embodiment of the family, and all of the emotions associated with the family come to sight there. And then people understandably feel that you're threatening them very deeply, threatening their families if you threaten their homes. And it's easy to laugh at some of the funny things that, NIMBYs will say, but I also understand where that's coming from. And I understand why, to some extent, we are always going to be going around that rather than ever really conquering it.
That's really interesting because I think that a number of years ago, I'm a big National Geographic reader and they have so many great articles, but there was one piece about, adolescence and how your brain chemicals change and what that means in terms of being able to go out on your own and leave the home between 18 and 25, basically before your formative years are formed.
Right.
And so what you're talking about is basically kind of the same thing where the chemicals in your brain and how you're change to a point where you get to that switch point at 25, 26 years old, where home is home versus home is somewhere I need to escape or something that needs to change, right? And I think that's just an interesting dichotomy between those two phases.
Well, it's very much related to pairing and family formation too, which is happening, of course, later and later now. But I think that, I'll tell you a funny story about this, right? In Canberra, Australia, there is a wonderful bird called the Australian magpie, which is a great bird to have around because it has a wonderful song. But in the spring, when it's nesting, it adopts a very wide perimeter around its nest as the thing it needs to defend. And it will attack cyclists in particular. It doesn't attack, cars are going by too fast and pedestrians are going by too slowly, but there's something about the way a cyclist glides at a certain speed that I think reminds these birds of a hawk or some other sort of predator. And so they will attack cyclists. They will come down on them and peck them on the heads, and there are occasional bad accidents. And during that season, cyclists will sometimes attach colorful pipe cleaners to the top of their helmets so that they all look like space aliens in a grade school play, because this seems to deter these attacks. And so that's home. That's NIMBYism, isn't it? That's the defensive home, and particularly nesting. It's when home becomes the same thing as family, which is what nesting is, right? And understandably, we don't just have a single perimeter of home. We have a series of concentric perimeters that we defend to different degrees, and which is why, and one of the interesting things I think that the media has done, I'm thinking out loud here, one of the interesting things the media seems to have done is to give us all impractically large defensive perimeters, where we now feel threatened by things that are just, that we can't possibly defend against, and that are not really practical to feel threatened by. And so it's the whole neighborhood preservation thing, the whole protect our neighborhood thing, it's protecting the nest. And, you're not going to reason with this bird about that. This bird's going to protect what it needs to protect to feel comfortable that its family is safe. And I think that's real. So all of which is to say, I think that the defensive home will still always continue to be part of human nature. And I think that also when we come over to transit, there's a particular thing going on in transit, which is that our decision makers live at lower density and drive cars more than our transit riders do. And that really the ideal market, the markets that transit can most compete for are underrepresented among our decision makers. It's not that they're poor so much, it's just that they live at higher density. And the challenge for that then is that within the context of the Regional Transit Agency especially, we are always being asked why we can't make this thing more suited to the outer suburb. And why we can't make this thing more appropriate to a suburban scale. And the answer is we can. It's just a less efficient scale. It has a higher cost per rider. It has a lower number of riders, lower bang for buck by almost any measure. And the conversation that happens around that, about what people are entitled to, or is very confusing. It's something I've done a lot of work on trying to talk about rationally and help city communities talk about rationally.
What are the pipe cleaners then? What are the things that we can put in our hair to keep the birds from diving on us?
Well, I think ironically, the city is a different idea of home. The city is an idea that home is a shared place, that our security as at home in the city arises more from our cooperation with one another than from our personal defensive system, and that is just an inevitable feature of density. I think it's interesting that what we're starting to see initially at the sort of in the notion of urbanism. The whole notion of urbanism is pretty new, right? The whole notion that there is an urban point of view, a point of view that arises from sheer density, is pretty new.
The language of it, or
well, I mean, there's always been the study of cities. There's always been the understanding of cities. But I think of our politics starting more and more to organize itself around the idea that the urban is a constituency. The urban, irrespective of race, class, gender, everything else that's going on, to be urban is to be in a particular common situation, and that it is to have a particular common sense of home that is just fundamentally different from the sense of home that you can have in suburban life or certainly in rural life, where inevitably your home is much more your private home. You're much more focused on the defense of that, and correspondingly too, many things that are government services in the city are your own responsibility at low density. If you live on a ranch, on a 100-acre ranch, the water department is your well, the sewer department is your septic tank, the police department is your gun, and the fire department is the pond, right?
And a bucket.
And of course you feel self-reliant, and of course you feel like you don't need much government, because you don't. So it's interesting, the whole question about this whole notion that we should be having a debate about how much government is enough is silly, because the answer is obviously it depends on the density you live at. And so we have this stereotype in America that, big liberals are concentrated in big cities and they like more government. Well, of course, there's simply more that has to be done collectively. More that a citizen can't do for themselves has to trust a collective to do when you're living at high density. It's just a spatial geometric fact.
And that's our break. Every time you hear that music, that means we're going to go to the next clip. And this one is from episode 191. Tom Madrecki discussed what UPS thinks about cities.
How does UPS think of cities generally?
So I think that cities to UPS are both the future of what we do. We posit that upwards of 75% of our deliveries in the future will be made in urban environments. And so it's clearly a very critical part to figure out how do we deliver in urban environments. But then the other thing is that cities are also the most challenging neighborhoods to deliver in. They're the places with the greatest vertical density. They're the places with the most poorly managed curbsides in a way, or the lack of curbside space, the place where we get tickets the most. So there's all these tensions and issues within city environments that impact our business every day. So I think that how we see cities is an opportunity for our business, and not in like a IBM smart city sort of way, like, oh, we're going to sell a city something. But it's a challenge that we can proactively address and solve by working collaboratively with cities, thinking about the future of transportation, thinking about congestion mitigation strategies, thinking about how do you manage curbside, and then really, from our perspective, amid those challenges, to say, well, what can we do to deliver better in those environments and to make our operations more efficient and to solve some of those challenges that cities face and want to address?
How is UPS working with cities now? What are some of the things you guys are doing?
Right. So we actually have 30 plus pilot projects around the world to proactively engage cities and to work with them on solving issues around congestion, around air quality. A lot of those pilot projects actually started with a single pilot in the city of Hamburg in Germany. The city of Hamburg wanted to go car-free in their city center and came to us proactively in advance to say, hey, this is the direction that we're headed. What can you do with us? Which we actually really appreciated, because I think the difference in a situation like that, right, is that you're being approached on the front end of policymaking. And so we had an opportunity to work with the city. We deployed a series of electronic tricycles with the city. And so the way that we have to structure those projects is that there's a lot of approvals that are needed. There's different staging requirements for the packages to actually get into the city center. And so we worked with the city on that and then have applied that same model to other cities as we've gone and done different pilots. But we're also working in other places with data-focused pilots or things that aren't just electronic tricycles. So the diversity of solutions is there and growing. And then we're also very eager to proactively engage cities to work with them and to say, well, where do you want to go? What are your objectives? What do you want to achieve? And how can we maybe walk alongside you in that?
When I think of electronic tricycle, I think of like somebody sitting in a big wheel, like running around. But I know what you're talking about, basically like a 3-wheeled bicycle with a package vault in the back, I guess.
Right. I think the major logistics companies, even more than that, primarily UPS and DHL, are really pushing the bounds of what is possible through cycle logistics. The funny thing working at what is a trucking company, you end up sort of being the bike guy. You're like, oh, you're the guy that wants to do delivery by bike. That's never going to work. But the reality is that in certain types of neighborhood topologies and in certain levels of relative density, certain levels of traffic congestion with the right built environment factors around it, cycle delivery makes a lot of sense. The hard part is determining what those neighborhood topologies are. There isn't ample research around cyclogistics. The research to date basically starts to posit things that are like, well, cycle logistics doesn't make sense because the volume capacity of a bike versus a truck is inherently less, therefore it's less efficient. And or, well, if you compare the miles from a distribution center into a city, well, clearly the truck still makes sense because the truck has more capacity and so it's still more efficient. Well, that's not really the point. You actually really have to fundamentally shift your notion of like what the model looks like. How do you stage packages? What can you do around changing the way that a bike is designed so that you can maybe have like a preloaded package container on the back of each bike, and then you can bring those containers in with the bike at the same time, and then you can just sort of plug and play throughout the day, which increases the efficiency or like reduces the double handling that you would have to reload the bike each time you go back to that mini depot. So there's a lot of opportunity, I think, to really innovate and pioneer in that space, but it definitely requires some outside-the-box thinking and just a completely different notion of like what it means to deliver in cities.
If a university or a research organization was to do some research, like what would be the most important thing to learn at the moment?
So we are actually working with the University of Washington's Urban Freight Lab.
I didn't know they had an urban freight lab.
That's
I know,
cool. It's very cool. So Barb Ivanoff and Ann Goodchild there have this center that's just focused on urban freight issues and last mile delivery. They call the final 50 feet. And their grad students are going out and measuring like how long freight elevator doors stay open, what is the optimal length that those elevators should stay open based on those results, how long does it take somebody to deliver inside a building, how does what happens in the building impact how long that truck is parked on the street, because the reality is that oftentimes what's occurring off the street is impacting what's on the street. Like the two are inherently connected. They're not just this disconnected thing. And so I think that their research is really, really cool and pioneering in their efforts. I've also worked with Georgetown University on a project that was really cool with their data science students and as well as their urban planning students in the Washington, D.C. DOT. We've talked to and engaged the MIT Megacities Logistics Labs. Matthias Winkenbach there has, I think, done some really cool research as well. So I think that there's a lot of research that's actually going on around the country around urban freight. I think it's going from redheaded stepchild of the transportation planning universe to maybe like hipster cool kid of the future. I would like to think that. But specifically to bike delivery and things like that, I think it's really zeroing in on what is the appropriate delivery mode to each specific neighborhood topology. By figuring that out, not just for urban environments, but rural environments too, you can start to sketch a map where, well, maybe in this very far off rural area or completely inaccessible area, the hillsides of Rwanda, maybe drone delivery for urgent medical supplies, which UPS is actually doing, makes a lot of sense because that's the most economical and energy efficient and business efficient way of doing things. But then maybe in a drivable suburban area, it makes a lot of sense to just sort of have a traditional package car. Maybe in the future it's an e-vehicle or something like that. But in a historic neighborhood, it's an electronic tricycle. In a very dense neighborhood, maybe that's something completely different. So like just sketching what that neighborhood topology scale is and then what's the appropriate delivery method. I think that's like the wave of the future, and then optimizing to each of those topologies.
Back on episode 226, Susan Crawford joined us to talk about her book, Fiber. What got you into writing the book, or what made you want to write the book initially?
Well, I took a trip to Seoul. I needed to make a speech in New York City. I needed a shtick, something to talk about that would be interesting. And the Luddites I was going to talk to know nothing about South Korea, and I knew they'd be drawn to stories about what it's like to live there. And when I was there, several of the 20-somethings that I interviewed told me that coming to the U.S. is like taking a rural vacation because our connectivity is so poor here. And I'd never been embarrassed to be an American. But that interaction, that set of interactions with people who felt as if they were living in a future that the U.S. wasn't sharing, led me to be curious about how that had happened. And I have quite a background in internet access policy from other parts of my life. So I started exploring, just going to other countries that have great fiber assets, not just between cities, which America has too, but also in what people call the last mile, the bit between the middle of a city, let's say, and a home and a business. Why do some countries have a lot of last mile fiber? Why doesn't the United States have that? And what's our plan to make the upgrade? I got very interested in the properties of fiber and actually made a trip to Corning to watch them making it. The cool thing about fiber is that as far as we know, its capacity, its bandwidth capacity potential is unlimited. As photonics advance, as we can cram more data onto light and send it through that very, very clear glass tube, it's as if the pixels fall away between you and anybody at a distance from you. There's just a pane of glass between you and the rest of the world. And that's amazing.
There's such an amazing metaphor for that, right? Like
Yeah.
you're looking through a window
It's just a window.
to other people. You mentioned going to Corning and watching the process. What
Yeah.
was something that you saw in the process that really was interesting or amazing, or you came back being like, wow, that was unbelievable?
What's amazing about the manufacture of fiber optic is how completely controlled it is. Every micron of this clear glass tube, which is just the size of a human hair in diameter, is completely controlled. And there are thousands of layers in every single hair-thin strand of fiber, and they know exactly what's in those thousands of layers. It's even hard to describe how carefully controlled this manufacturing process is. But going there and seeing it happen and then running down the stairs to see the fiber being drawn down 5 stories from a big glob of glass until its final resting place as a thin strand wound around a tube or what would you call a spool in the basement, that was amazing. So I think what surprised me was the complete control and sophistication of the process. If Americans understood how crazy amazing this stuff was, they'd have more respect for this subject, I think.
When you went to South Korea, what did you see that kind of brought out the idea in your mind that this is a really important future for the U.S. to follow?
It's of a piece with a lot of other issues that you and I care about. In South Korea, people just take unlimited communications capacity for granted. They never wait. They're very impatient as a people. They wouldn't stand for a dropped call. How could that possibly happen? And they assume that when needed, as needed, whatever bandwidth is necessary for anything they want to do will be there and very cheap. It's just faded into the background for them. It's like electricity is for us. And it became clear to me that their cultural limitations, which are several, that anything new you do in South Korea is usually bought up by Samsung. It's a very hierarchical kind of controlled society, especially for young people. That was putting them at a slight disadvantage, but their technology was way ahead of us. And I thought that if the U.S. could make the technological leap, we could be the place where new inventions, new industries, new ways of making a living come from and assure all of our people a role in the 21st century rather than a role in the past. This whole story has been amplified for me by what I've learned after writing the book about China. China plans to have 80% of its homes connected to fiber optic in short order. And the entire Belt Road Initiative, which involves a lot of trains crossing Central Asia, is also going to be accompanied by fiber and advanced wireless. So China knows what they're up to. And the U.S., by contrast, doesn't seem to have a plan.
If somebody did have a plan, would they be praised like LBJ, who you talked to Robert Cairo, and he mentioned that LBJ brought the lights.
Yes.
And so a lot of people had mentioned that, and they might not have liked him personally, but they liked that he brought electrification to, or electric, utility to the state of Texas and other places. Is that something that somebody existing now could do in the United States, or is it just, are there so many barriers to that from private companies that it's a difficult process?
Look, we're the place the internet came from. We should be looking the rest of the world in the rearview mirror when it comes to internet access. And we are capable of great things as a nation. So I never give up on America's ability to do anything. And the change between the internet access we have now and the cheap, ubiquitous, persistent, reliable access that I'm describing in this book is actually a phase change. It's a difference in kind, not just in degree. So, yes, I think people would be very grateful for a cheap, reliable data connection. And just to go in a little bit more depth about this, not to be provided by the government, but made possible by the government. So through a wholesale, let's say, or dark fiber installation, not lit with these lasers, but the street grid made available by the government at a reasonable price to lots of retail operators would spur into being a competitive marketplace and very low prices, and just respect for poor people, rural people, people of color that right now are left out of world-class internet access.
What's dark fiber again? It's basically laying down fiber that exists and then other companies can have access to pulsing light through it?
That's right.
Okay.
So it's the blank the passive infrastructure, just the glass itself.
Lisa Bender, then president of the Minneapolis City Council, joined episode 225 to talk about Minneapolis 2040. Were you surprised at all the attention that's been on the plan so far from outside of Minneapolis?
Maybe a little surprised. I knew that it would be a big deal to make the moves that we did in our lowest intensity single-family neighborhoods. And again, it's one of these examples of kind of a philosophical change. By far, the vast majority of our new housing units are going to be in downtown, in large towers, and then in new, larger multifamily buildings on transit corridors, like it has been for the past several decades in our city. But this philosophical idea about who gets to live where, should neighborhoods be exclusively for single-family homes, and why? What does that really mean? What are we really saying? We also very specifically and intentionally couched this discussion in our city's history of racial exclusion in housing. I mean, we didn't skirt around that at all. We had many presentations about historic exclusion by race, by the federal government through redlining, through racially restrictive covenants. And then if you overlay those maps with our current zoning map, the one that we will now update after Minneapolis 2040, they're really the same map. So our single-family zoning, perpetuating a legacy of exclusion from neighborhoods that were also had a history of exclusion. We had a lot of pushback, of course.
Yeah.
I mean, so people would say things like, well, you're not going to solve race equity just by allowing a duplex in, whatever neighborhood. And of course not. Like, that is absolutely not what we were arguing. But we were arguing that at the very least, the very minimal thing that we can do as a city is to remove this barrier, to change the pattern, and to start to move away from this idea that living in this particular way is good and desirable and living this other way is not, and to just start to open it up to more choice, to more options, to gradually change over time.
Did you see any light bulbs go off in people's minds whenever they were told about the redlining and racial history of zoning in the city?
I think we did have a lot of very thoughtful comments about that. And a local college here called Augsburg College is doing a project called the Mapping Prejudice Project, which is uncovering all of these old racially restrictive covenants and reading the language, and I think hearing about it and talking about it head on in hundreds of community discussions. Yeah, I think it did really inspire people to think critically about the patterns of our city and how it got that way. It wasn't an accident. It was an intentional set of policy decisions over many years.
So eliminate disparities, living wage jobs, equitable public participation. Those are just some of the goals of the 2040 plan. And then there's also 100 policies tied to those. And I must say it's easily connected through the wonderful Minneapolis2040.com website. How are the goals and policies developed?
This was really important. So I think the process side was actually critical to us being able to adopt the plan that we did. We had to finish this plan by the end of last year, which was the first year of a council term. In Minneapolis, we elect a mayor citywide who, in this particular case, in this kind of policy, doesn't have a vote, has a veto, but doesn't have a direct vote in this kind of plan. And then we also at the same time elect all 13 council members, each of us who represent a district. So we were developing this plan over an election year in which every single elected official in the city was up for re-election. And I've seen many planning processes across the country over the years, especially in recent years. So I know how contentious zoning and land use and transportation decisions can become. So we were really thoughtful about how we set up the timing of each decision, and we were really intentional about being incremental in how we voted on the plan. So the very first thing we did was the city council voted on a community engagement plan. And it said, we're going to have small discussions with cultural communities. We're going to have open houses at these particular decision points in the plan. And what it didn't say, for example, was we're going to go to every single neighborhood in the organization in the city of Minneapolis and have a discussion with every single neighborhood about the particular land use in their neighborhood, which of course isn't feasible. We didn't have time to do that anyway, but we voted on that as a city council. So all of my colleagues got a chance to review the engagement plan and vote on it. And then the second thing we did was vote on the goals. So we adopted 14 goals, and we had some discussion about them. We added a 14th goal to the original 13 that staff had proposed. And so that was a second action and a second chance for council to set what ended up being a really bold vision for a city. And then staff came back, with 100 policies. So I think if we had tried to do it all at the same time, without those incremental votes along the way, we would have had a harder time adopting such what I think is a pretty bold and visionary plan.
Yeah, it's interesting to see everything tied together. And in each of the 100 policies isn't separate per se. It's all tied into the goals. And at least from the website, from what I've seen, maybe one policy has, 5 or 10 of the goals. There's tons of policies, but they can relate to a number of different goals. It's not necessarily one. They're not separated out like that. And I thought that was really interesting.
This was the first time we did our comprehensive plan online like this. And we did get some pushback. So we got pushback from people who wanted to review the whole document as one thing and comment on it that way, like print out a paper thing and write on it. So our staff did end up making a PDF version of the plan. Our staff just did such an amazing job. They went so above and beyond creating the website and creating opportunity for people to comment with maps, then adjusting as people didn't feel comfortable with the technology and making it so that people could do a paper version if they wanted. So they just did such a good job on all of it.
Now going back to episode 223, David Wasserman and Matthias Buehler talk about 3D cities. So there's a benefit to the program in that you can generate a lot of buildings really quickly. And it seems like, and I know, Matt, you worked on the most recent Independence Day film. And what was it like to build a bunch of buildings, have the procedures in place, and then have to blow them all up?
Well, it was quite, I would say, it was an absolute honor. And for me, it was at least a 15-year-old dream that I had, that I wanted to work in visual effects one day. No clue how I would ever do that, but I made it, yeah. How do you feel if you're creating something that gets blown up in the end? Well, you feel amazing. No, it was quite a challenge. It was quite a challenge because if you're joining a company that is doing Hollywood quality visual effects and destroying cities, and I was working at Scanline Visual Effects, and they had been working on movies like 300 or destruction movies like 2012, which is one of the most famous movies by Roland Emmerich, where everything gets destroyed, or also the other one where Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson is playing in the lead role, called San Andreas. And so I came in pretty much after those productions, and they said, well, we need to create cities that look like this big, but we have to produce them a lot faster. And then you're saying, okay, now there's a challenge, but it has been done. It has been proven that other people that were using City Engine for, Cars 2 by Pixar and by Man of Steel and so on. So people had been using City Engine quite a few times before, but for me, it was really literally also the first time working in that industry. So to me personally, it was quite a big challenge, but made it happen.
So when you're writing the code or the rules for inside of CityEngine, like the complete street rule or writing code to build these buildings really quickly, how much time does it take to get the details right to make it feel like it's a real place or actually a real city?
That's a good question. It's also an important question because you need to be very clear about what is your end goal or what is the task at hand. If you're doing, let's say, GIS analysis, in a lot of times the buildings can easily enough just be boxes. But if you're going towards, let's say, the entertainment industry, for example, film or games, there basically the amount of code and detail is dictated by the closeness to the camera or to the observer. The closer a building can get to the camera, the exponentially more details you need to show. So if you look at, for example, at a street from quite far a distance, you can see, okay, it needs to be great and a couple of sticky things have to be there, which are the lamp poles, and that's good enough. But if you want to be close up and you need to have bus stations and all the line work needs to make sense, there you have a lot more effort that you have to put into, a lot more logic, which the observer or this, let's say, the cinema goer actually has to consider real.
I think I want to add more to that as well, because I think from a planning practitioner perspective, it also depends on how you're going to be using the models. If you're going to be using it for conceptual drawing of what a complete street improvement could be, or trying to look at how elements of the street could be reconfigured, the level of detail required is much lower than if you're trying to do something that's a lot more detailed. And I think there are two main barriers when we're talking about how you use and how you code CGA. One is a lot of the high detail 3D models that you could create with procedural modeling in CityEngine can be limited by the assets that you have available. For example, 3D models, there are different libraries like SketchUp's own repository and others that you can, in theory, use for models. But getting the vast majority of diverse assets that you need, everything from dirt maps, which are like image overlays over textures that you add to 3D models that make your images look gritty and more realistic, to other types of details related to how a particular window or a car should look, all kind of play into the degree of realism that you can get at certain distances away from the observer. And I think that's a very large challenge. I think we need a lot more open source 3D assets to be available so that it's easier to recreate cities at higher levels of detail. But also, I think there's a degree in which procedural modeling gets incredibly difficult to get down to the details without some type of manual drawing. A good example, for me at least in CityEngine, is how you depict intersections can be very complicated, where sometimes we might just develop a lot of the baseline information procedurally, but then we might draw some shapes to depict certain things like bulb outs and those types of elements, either using the drawing tools in CityEngine or taking the model into SketchUp or 3D CAD software to make those edits there.
In this next clip from episode 259, Anne Goodchild discusses urban freight.
You also mentioned that over time you hadn't had really good data from the freight providers because they were mostly doing their own thing and not necessarily, I guess, sharing, even though they probably weren't asked to share that much.
Right.
Are they open to sharing now? Is it a different situation?
Yeah, this is another question, that we get asked a lot. So I would say what's different is that we have relationships. We have trust and we have a shared understanding of goals. And that's what it takes to share. Mm-hmm. You share with your friends because you trust them. You know why they're asking you things that they're asking you. You know what they're going to do with sensitive information. And you tell them things that you don't tell strangers. So I saw at the beginning of my research career this obstacle to the researcher, which is, from the researcher's point of view, you think, oh, I need this data. I'll go ask the person who has it to just give it to me. And they don't know who you are. They don't know what you're going to do with it. And it's a very one-sided request. And sometimes it's quite difficult to promise, what's going to come of it. And the other thing, that I'll say is if I asked you right now, how much money you made last year, you'd probably feel a little shocked, a little uncomfortable, and you'd want to know, why.
Uh-huh.
And, you might be willing in a survey to share that information if you understood the purpose, and maybe it was in a band, it wasn't a specific number, right? So you're not entirely unwilling, but you need a bit more than that. And so, again, that's what we've built with the Urban Freight Lab, is a community with a shared purpose, complete transparency of that purpose. And, once you have that, people have been, they've joined the lab. They have an interest in having conversations and participating and getting somewhere. And they're very much willing to bring information to that discussion. But, there has to be some context. There has to be some motivation. Usually it's more specific. So, do you have data on failed delivery rates for this zip code that you would be willing to share? Okay, it's in the service of, this larger project where we're testing a solution that might improve your failed delivery rate. And, that's all very appropriate. My students, I tell them it's sort of like, well, you're moving and you want someone to help you move, right? So you say, I need a friend. Well, maybe you need a friend. And then when you have a friend and you're moving, they would be willing to help you with that. So there have to be benefits and goals on both sides, not just on the researcher's side. And that's something else that is really essential to the structure of the Urban Freight Lab. People often ask me, what my agenda is for research. And that's not what we study at the Urban Freight Lab. My opinion is included, but what we study is what's of shared interest and importance to all of our members. And so, I want people in the lab so that I can understand their problems and, serve those issues with our research, not to serve, my goals in research. And we really mean that. And I think that's also one of the ways that we've generated trust and partnerships is through that principle.
What's the biggest misconception about urban freight?
Yeah, well, that's a cool question. I've never been asked that one before. I think that, all freight moves around in cities in 53-foot sort of trailers, so, semi-trucks, and that what we have to do is, make the city accommodate them.
Yeah, we think that it's all going around on big trucks, but it's something that can be, I guess, brought around on smaller vehicles and has different profiles and has different reasons for being, I guess.
Yeah, and I think, most people, when you say the word freight, they will think of very large freight generators like a port or a warehouse or a manufacturing facility. And maybe it's that those big vehicles are more visible and more notable. And that's a certain flavor of freight. And we have certain strategies for dealing with that from a transportation planning perspective. It's largely to separate those kinds of facilities from residences, sort of assign those vehicles to larger streets or arterials. But that's not the kind of freight that we're studying in the Urban Freight Lab. And it's not the kind of freight that really provides, what I would say is the most complexity, and that's changing a lot right now. So there's also freight. Every time you buy food, every time you go to a store or a restaurant or a coffee shop, you are connecting with freight. It might be brought to your home, right? It's a care package. It's the FedEx truck bringing your Christmas presents. So it's also essentially the logistics of living in a city. We need a goods delivery system to survive in cities. We're not growing our own food. We're not dealing with our own waste. And this is an essential, system like clean water and transportation and electricity. And like a lot of those systems, it can be very invisible to people. And usually when it's working well, it's kind of invisible. And for a long time, that stuff already moves in quite a mix of vehicles. There's, bike messengers have been around for a long time. They take packages on their bikes. The Postal Service is a long history of sort of context-sensitive delivery vehicles, like, they'll have walking delivery people. I'm sure somewhere they have USPS people on horses. They have specialized little Jeeps. That's also freight, and that's, a much more substantial number of vehicles in cities are moving that kind of freight. The other is service vehicles. So a plumber, an electrician, somebody in the construction trade who's working on a building and using their vehicle as their tool shed. That's also freight and a very large proportion of what we see moving around in cities. So I think people, when they think about just sort of the big, maybe port-related trucks, they can imagine a world where they just want that to go away and not be in their neighborhood. But what we're working on in the Urban Freight Lab is this kind of freight that's impossible to separate from your neighborhood because it serves your neighborhood. And the more we buy online, the more services we ask to be delivered to our home, the more we're requesting that those things come into our communities, like the milkman and the mailman. They've been part of our communities for a long time. And actually, that's freight too.
Giacomo Lozzi of Polis in Europe joined us in episode 262 to talk about sustainable urban procurement. And a lot of cities in Europe seem to be focused on, vehicle trips into the urban core. I know that Madrid and Paris and even London are reducing vehicle trips into the center of the city, Stockholm too. And I'm wondering how the idea of procurement was thought of, because obviously from the report, there's a lot of emissions that come from procurement, whether that's goods or services or other things. I'm wondering how the idea came about to think about procurement from this perspective of transportation.
The idea came because the public procurement is something that cities can directly influence. I work specifically on urban freight and logistics within Polis, and we started a working group on urban freight 5 years ago. But before that, the interest of cities towards logistics was quite poor. I would say in the last 10 years, they started to be more aware of the fact that they can manage also the transportation of goods and services and not only passengers. But at the same time, it's true that companies have control of their logistics movements. And so it's quite difficult for cities to, first of all, understand what's the type of movements of the private sector and also to influence that. So through procurement, we thought there would be a direct link between the type of transportation the suppliers put in place and what the city can decide. For example, when they set a contract with a supplier, they can ask the supplier to deliver through zero-emission vehicles or to bring all the goods to a consolidation center from which then all the deliveries are made with a consolidated in a consolidated manner. So we really wanted to exploit the power of cities in terms of purchasing body so that they could directly influence and also give a good example as procurer towards other organizations that could be private or public, but that can influence the way they get goods and services supplied.
In the report, I saw that there's 6 procurement categories. There's the vehicles that are owned by the government. There's transportation services from private operators. There's other services such as cleaning and catering and plumbing and goods movement is the other one. And then construction for public infrastructure. And then finally, things like consultant services. And the middle 3 were the ones that were the most important. Do you have one that interests you the most out of that group?
So first of all, these are 6 categories that we identified in general. But then within the project, we decided to focus only on 3, which are goods, services, and construction. So we thought that the procurement process of vehicles or transportation services, like, for example, bus services or disabled transport, are already quite developed in many cities. And most of all, there's a specific regulation from the European Commission requiring a threshold of these vehicles procured in a sustainable way. So we decided to focus on parts that is more neglected and which is indeed services, goods and construction. I have to say that the one that for me has the most potential is the service one. And it's also the less visible because we always tend to associate freight to goods like parcels, e-commerce and these kind of things. But there's a huge amount of movements that are generated by the delivery of services like maintenance and repair, which indeed was identified by all the cities like the one that had the strongest impact. this is not only for procurement of public authorities, but if we think about all the type of services we require for our households, these people have to come with a van, and normally there are small suppliers that don't have the means to buy a zero-emission vehicle. So I think the focus for the future, starting from BiCETS, should be on this type of deliveries.
Yeah, and that was totally interesting to me, and that's kind of what stuck out to me is all of the plumbers and the caterers and the maintenance folks that you're talking about, building maintenance that have to drive from building to building all over cities. We don't think about that necessarily as something that government can influence in terms of emissions, but they can because of the vehicles that they're driving. What are some of the ways that government, in terms of their procurement, can influence the change to more energy efficient transport?
Yeah, so for example, what we did in BiCETS is to set some minimum criteria that supplier has to satisfy when it applies for a public tender for service. But the very important part of this process is market engagement, which means that the city, before setting the requirements, went to the market, got involved with the main suppliers of the sector, or the ones that had already a contract, and asked what would be feasible for them, because cities don't want neither to get zero offers when they set a tender. So they need to ask for a credible and feasible criteria. So they first of all went to understand which is the market, which is the potential, and which are the obstacles to zero emission transportation. And this was very useful to set up the tender. The problem is always about money, of course, but incentives and subsidies are a way for city to help, especially small players, to afford a zero-emission vehicle. But there are also other ways, because if you just replace a normal vehicle with a zero-emission vehicle, you don't solve the congestion problem. So there are some other possibilities linked to consolidation. In that sense, is more related to goods, but also the use of smaller vehicles like cargo bikes, for example. So there are many service providers that could use a cargo bike for if they have to work in a specific condensed area and they don't have to make a lot of movements. They could bring their tools on a cargo bike and avoid the usage of van, for example. Or the type of interventions could be consolidated. So sometimes cities realize that different departments asked for the same type of service in different moments in the same week, for example. The procurement procedure is not centralized. So this is also a way, very simple and cost effective, to avoid duplicate trips.
In episode 295, Andre Perry joined us to talk about his book, Know Your Price.
I appreciated your history as well. You know, Black people being excluded from jobs in the auto industry, and then their homes devalued compared to similar white homes, tax collection reduced in all Black cities, reducing services and more jobs, and it goes on and on. You've measured the current devaluation. I'm wondering if you had any ideas about kind of the compound interest on such a number that you've created.
We're actually right now trying to measure the compound interest because, you know, people hear 156 billion and they go, is that over 10 years, 20 years? I was like, no, that's just 2017 data.
Yeah.
But we know wealth begets wealth, and not having wealth essentially creates conditions where you're constantly in debt. And so we need to measure that. And that gets into a conversation about reparations and restitution, because the reason why there's housing devaluation has a lot to do with the redlining policies. There's been policy violence leveled against Black America that comes out in the wash in the devaluation research. And so there are structures that are responsible for the devaluation, and we can point to them. So we need to figure out ways to restore value that has been robbed from Black people and Black communities.
What's the importance of majority Black cities to Black people?
You know, we treat Black cities like Black people. And so when you're looking at the leadership in, say, Detroit, I'm pointing to Kwame Kilpatrick. He's a leader that had a lot of issues. Don't get me wrong. But the collapse of Detroit had less to do with Kwame, more to do with white flight, the auto industry getting their way in terms of taxes, in terms of benefits from the city. During the recession, the Big Three had a lot of responsibility to the people of the city of Detroit, and they failed in a lot of different ways. But we point to Black leaders as the problem. I look at Black institutions in terms of school boards, in terms of other institutions, and they're constantly beat up. They're constantly blamed. They're constantly devalued. And again, it points to that we treat Black institutions and Black cities like Black people. And the casualness in which former officer Derek Chauvin, the casualness in which he put his knee in the back of the neck of George Floyd, those same attitudes are held by real estate agents. They're held by corporate executives. They're held by lenders. And so we've got to eliminate those attitudes and structures that casually devalue Black cities. There's no question many cities like my hometown of Wilkinsburg would see greater investment if white people were in them or more white people were in them. And so we got to change that because a home shouldn't be valued that differently from one or the other based on the race of the people around them. Again, it goes back to that tradition of saying that Black people are riskier than other people, that Black people are going to use more services, so we better jack up their property taxes, or Black people are here, so we should assess their property lower. These things are just ridiculous. It's ridiculous. And it's the reason why many Black places aren't developing, because of the perception of them, not because of the assets or the people.
And that's the thing that struck me about Wilkinsburg and Larimer and the places along the East Busway, because, they do have those bones, the walkable street networks and the houses that could be renovated and those types of things. It seems you look at it and you're like, well, why isn't this happening? It seems silly.
Yeah, I love my town because when I was growing up in it, it had everything to offer, and it still does.
Yep.
Its proximity, the housing stock, the transportation, everything is there. It's ripe for investment and growth. But folks see Black people and there's fear. And there has been violence in Wilkinsburg. But the reasons for that violence is a lack of investment. And so at some point, we've got to commit ourselves to just basic facts, that it is a fact that this place, Wilkinsburg, is prime for investment. And we should be investing in the people in that town, just like we should invest in the people of Google. That nothing grows without investment. And if we want to see growth in Wilkinsburg, we should be investing in the quality assets, the quality people of it.
And that's an important point, I think, that you make in the book, too, is that you need to invest in the people and not necessarily just the places. I mean, otherwise you'll get the gentrification pattern, right? You'll get the Google moving in and the Black people moving out.
That's exactly right. And a lot of people always ask me, what do you think of opportunity zones? I have that same response. I say that, I'm less interested in initiatives that don't put checks in the hands of business owners, potential homeowners, current homeowners, entrepreneurs. Those are the kinds of investments that matter, particularly for Black people, because we've never had that trust with the banking community, with financial institutions. We see less business loans. When we do get business loans, they're at higher rates. And so we need to see direct investment. No one's worried about growth and gentrification when you own things in a place. So if you own a laundry shop in Wilkinsburg, you're not worried about gentrification. You're encouraging it, or encouraging, I should say, growth in the city. We need to put investments directly in the hands of people and place, but to decouple people in place is essentially to encourage gentrification. You'll develop the place, wages are stagnated, folks will ultimately be priced out. So you have to invest in people so that they can have a stake in the place itself.
Sarah Hendren joined episode 308 to talk about her book, What a Body Can Do. And it leads also to the discussion you have about Steve, the man with ALS, and his sailing house.
Yeah.
She had designed. It's an amazing discussion about how you can live with assistance, but also designed for your own kind of independence as well.
That's right. So Steve Sailing comes at the end of this chapter that we meet Ed Robertson called Room. So it's this chapter about thinking about the room as the site of making a life worth living and rethinking independence, and thinking about richly about dwelling, like all the stuff that we do in our interiors. But Steve Sailing is now 14 years into an ALS diagnosis. And when he got his diagnosis 14 years ago, he was trained as a landscape architect. So he was trained to think in terms of design. And like anyone, started watching, of course, pharmacology and research in science for a cure, would want a cure, but understood also that he might design a life worth living as his mobility diminished. And his mobility is quite diminished now. He uses just small head movements and his eyes as his only mobility. But what he orchestrated for himself is a residence that he could live in with that rich idea of independence in mind and the legacy of Roberts and others. So what that looks like in terms of technology is that he's got a cursor that's mounted on the nose bridge of his eyeglasses that talks to a wheelchair-mounted tablet that will open and close all the doors, open and summon all the elevators in the residence. This is on a floor of a nursing home in Boston. It will also turn off and on the media and music. It will, run the HVAC in his room. It will, do all kinds of automated, we would think now of as smart home technologies, but it's a closed loop system that he orchestrated before those technologies came to the market. And by the way, are utterly private and free from the deal that we've made in smart home technologies to sell our data and so on. That's another topic of conversation. Yeah. So Steve has said repeatedly that in the absence of medicine, technology is the cure, he would say, for ALS. And I try to sketch in the book both what that means to hold both things to be true, right? That he would rejoice tomorrow in being cured of ALS, but that he also built a life worth living, with technology, but also with care. And there again, the legacy of Roberts and others is really vivid when we say, for any of us, right? When and if our bodies change, what's the life that we'd want to build, right? And would it be a life free of help in it? Maybe not. Maybe a life worth living already includes help, the kind that we don't acknowledge if we're non-disabled people at the moment, but also that help might be creatively reconsidered, And so Steve lives in this beautiful home that looks like a home, that is painted in warm organic colors and looks like a living room and nothing like the cold clinical setting of a hospital. It is impressively designed with technology, and it also is a site of human care. And he's very busy and fundraising and doing all kinds of things all the time. And I think it challenges a lot of folks' idea of their own independence, honestly. I think ALS is a hard diagnosis, and it also is a portal to understanding some really deep wisdom that disabled people have known for a long time.
In that realm, there's the technology discussion, right? And when I was reading your book, I thought about on my back porch, there's a lot of plants, and we net them because there's squirrels and crows and things. And the other day I came up and there was a pebble from the backyard sitting on the back porch. And the only way that could get up there was by a crow, and the crow using a tool. And it just made me think of that when I was reading your book, because often we think about technology as something in the future, but rather it's something that aids us in what we're trying to do as humans even. And I just found that fascinating.
Yeah, it's so true. And we get to that discussion because of an interesting thing in my field, right, which is just the specializing of technologies for disability as being labeled assistive technologies, right? And I use that term, it's a shorthand in the field, but it's a really telling redundancy, right? As though all technologies, what are they doing if not assisting? They are assisting fundamentally. And so I try to take that kind of, new eyes, estranged look at what it means to be a body at all. And I think there's a reason why we locate tool use as a key moment in developing human civilizations. It's not the only one. Sociality is equally as important for sure. But tool use nonetheless is how we just make an abstract plan in our minds and get something done. It's how we would have hunted and gathered in the past and built fire and those things. And it's how we, outsource our brain power in lots of ways to smartphones now to free up our mind to do other kinds of human tasks. And so what do we gain by looking at this anew? For me, it's this kind of wonder that maybe the extended body with stuff, and I'm talking about pencil, chopsticks, but also hearing aids and eyeglasses, maybe the extended body is the natural state of the body. Maybe that is what it means, right? To never to be not extended. And if we see it that way, then we see all of ourselves as getting assistance from our assistive tools. And that means we live on the planet where people need help. And if everybody needs help, right, then there's a kind of continuum that doesn't make us all the same by any means, right? We're different across multiple axes. But nonetheless, if we see that connection, then we stop maybe thinking in such patronizing terms about people with disabilities, or in sort of pitying terms about folks who are living with less mobility or mathematical intelligence than others. And we think of ourselves as slightly more human, as a result.
And that kind of goes to the normalization discussion, how we decided to create norms. And it's interesting to think about why we do things like compare ourselves to X% of other people and those types of things.
That's right. Yeah, the fortification of normalcy with desirability, right? So the normal, I do the most kind of cursory history. This is a long and complicated history, but the way that normal became sort of the sciences of statistics and averages became not just a way to measure one another, but also a way to grade and rank and hierarchize one another. So folks may know that normalcy in the population sense is just an inheritance of the social sciences that was, early 19th century phenomenon. So it hasn't been with us forever. And of course, the social sciences are really useful to us for understanding each other at population scale. We want to understand groups and how they behave. But the legacy, the sort of pernicious kind of shaping of the meaning of normal over the course of the 19th century and at its peak in the eugenics moment of the early 20th century is the conflation of normalcy with what is good, and even the enhancement and the pursuit of normalcy. And so, right, meaning just the idea that humans can be graded in their physical qualities, but also their moral and intellectual qualities. And when you wed that with a kind of nationalist fervor, late 19th century, early 20th century, of improving nations as a whole, then you get this kind of eugenics wish to weed out undesirables, right? And to promote the so-called desirable norm. And, folks maybe even think that, right, we can probably agree that the ugliest eugenics violence is behind us. And yet the long legacy of that, it's a nonlinear one, but the long legacy of that is still with us in the sense that if you go to the pediatrician's office with your child, they are graded, right, on percentiles. The way they are spoken about overwhelmingly and in high stakes testing and so on is about where they fall percentile wise compared to their peers. Again, it's useful on some scales, but it has a way of creeping into our evaluative and descriptive language about each other in general, how we measure up compared to others, and whether we are ahead of the curve or not, and whether our child can compete, and so on. And so it frames life as a race and a kind of curve of gradations and achievements that I don't think any of us want to be held under sway, under that sway. I think we want our lives actually to have dignity on other grounds, full stop. So normalcy is this kind of in the water perniciousness. I mean, frankly, we have seen some eugenic logic in the rationing of ventilators and all that speculative discussion that happened this year around COVID-19. It was pretty clear, actually, that folks were making calculuses in their heads about whose lives are worth living or not, and who had a quality of life and so on. And so it is at the door, I think, that same kind of grading of one another. And I can say to you quite strongly that I think each of us wants to establish a kind of dignity of human life. And of course, that does beg for first principles and other kinds of grounds, like how do we know what is a human life worth? It gets pretty deep and philosophical pretty quickly, right?
Ian Brown, former managing director of London Rail, joined us on episode 118.
Can you talk a little bit more about what you mentioned in terms of social inclusion? I thought that was one of the most interesting pieces that I saw in your write-up for the Eno Foundation, just because I thought it was a really interesting kind of flipping of the frame.
The hard part with social inclusion was politically, social inclusion, deprived areas, price of housing, all those issues are very important issues. They're very, very difficult to define them in business case methodology and to claim benefits. Now, the East London Line extension, which is one of the ones I did, which is to build a north-south line across the east side of London, National Rail, joining the Underground with National Rail and running the trains through, was based on the need to serve areas where people can afford to live and then travel within, and we defined 45 minutes as a reasonable travelling time at integrated fares to service the City of London and Canary Wharf. And then the business case for the East London Line, the business cost ratio was 1.3. And we went to see with the Mayor to see the Secretary of State, and he said, well, we can't justify it on the normal transportation basis. And the Mayor said, well, we've got a different basis to justify it on. And the Secretary of State said, well, over to you then, get on with it. And that was a £1.2 billion scheme to use old infrastructure and a bit of new and actually provide an integrated service. Was it successful, and are we proud of it? Well, depends how you look at it. Was it successful in terms of ridership? Fabulously successful. The trains are packed. They've now been lengthened once and they're going to be lengthened again. Was it successful in terms of social inclusion? Well, it certainly allowed people to go and do these jobs, servicing the economy. The difficult part is that house prices along the route have gone up significantly. So if you look back on it, it's evened up house prices across London, but there's another job to be done in terms of social inclusion. A lot of people have made a lot of money out of it, so there's a sort of slight negative there that the economy does react to these things. What it has done, though, I mean, where we've been lucky is that, and I've seen the difference in the United States, is that the fares in Britain are quite high generally, and that's allowed, in terms of OPEX, for most railways to cover their direct costs. So as long as you only ask for £200 million at a time, that sounds pompous, but that's the sort of level you can get from a borrowing point of view. And then it's only a capital injection, but you're not asking for subsidy after subsidy. It's a very good model indeed. And the concern was always with me and my team was, are these people capable of doing these schemes on time and on budget? And I started with 5 extensions to the Docklands Light Railway. Then we let loose on the overground system, and they were okay, generally. And then came the big one, Crossrail, to go to the Treasury and say, I want £16.7 billion to build Crossrail. The key question is this going to be a fiasco for government? And of course, they put in all sorts of intervention points, take over by government, firing me and everybody else if it went wrong. But eventually, we did come up with a model based on success, because it was recognised that London is key to the UK. And there was a lot of negative comment about spending so much money on the richest city in Britain, of course, when there's the northern parts, Scotland, etc. But the case was made partly on the UK economy as well as the London economy. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, we try to sell transit lines all the time in terms of economic development and those types of issues. A lot of the metrics that we have for the FTA and others in terms of funding light rail lines and subways, etc., get kind of wonky. And I think sometimes the connection to jobs and the connection to employment from housing it's there, but it's sometimes lost. We have these really wonky terms.
I agree.
Yeah. We have these really wonky terms like T-sub, which is Transportation System User Benefits. A buddy of mine actually named his band T-sub because it's so wonky and nerdy. So we have those issues as well. The other big thing is kind of the funding of it, though. I saw a piece recently that even though it won't start operating for another year, Crossrail has generated about £5.5 billion in value. And I was wondering, did you guys put together a value capture scheme for that alignment?
We did put a value capture scheme in terms of business rates across London. Initially, the Mayor put forward a consultation based on the whole of London. And that was quite contentious, about 15 miles away from Crossrail's alignment, saying, I don't want to pay all this extra business rate for Crossrail. So it was then restructured into 3 tiers towards the line itself, then within striking distance of the line, and then a low payment, i.e. probably near nothing, for places like Croydon, who are miles away from the line. So the funding of Crossrail was partly because of that. Direct government funding about a third, and securitized income, of course, which is enormous, about another third as well. But one argument, I spent months on this, is about the value capture. And the initial, possibly naive idea is to value capture and then spend that money on the project. and it needs a mechanism. And as you've inferred, Jeff, that's quite difficult to achieve. Mm-hmm. What we've realised over time is that as long as those benefits, the 5 billion, for instance, for Crossrail, we've already built it, it's made more money than it's cost so far. Well, not quite, you know what I mean? As long as it comes to the economy, and the economy is paying for your railway via the Treasury, it doesn't actually matter whether you actually capture it, as long as it is captured by government. And now the Price Waterhouse, you see, does that make any sense?
Yeah, that's an interesting way of phrasing it, because we often think of a direct link between the investment and the returns. But I agree with you in that there's so much more that can be captured, although, you know, as long as the people are paying taxes and they're actually getting something from it, I guess you're getting something back. Though I think that there's a lot of folks, and you mentioned just briefly PricewaterhouseCoopers, but I imagine there's a lot of folks in the United States and in cities that are building these lines that want to see a direct return, and that can be specifically tied to that investment rather than kind of this overall agglomeration of value.
Yes, but I mean, we did do that. We have done the business rate, but the actual money actually raised is far less than the value that's been created. So somebody's captured it somewhere and the government take the tax. That's why I say that. I think you're right. I don't think it's viable not to have some sort of linkage for at least a portion of the money. No, I mean, and for smaller schemes, it's got to be even more direct, of course. And smaller schemes, this is the City of London, the government of London and the government of the UK. So you can have a very big financial model with the economy of the whole country around. So all the money is sort of accounted for. Much more difficult with something like the Docklands Light Railway, where you're talking about a £200 million, say $300 million extension, which has to be directly there. When I first started on these schemes, I was wandering the streets like some sort of tramp, cap in hand, for what we call Section 106 planning gain applications. Somebody wants to build a block of flats, the council give permission, subject to a capital injection for transportation. Now that is very difficult because it's local borough councils who have got priorities for schools, social housing, and the railway has got to compete with them, of course, and sometimes lose. So that is actually, it's actually harder in a way to do something small like that than it is for something that's of significance to the whole country in respect. But the key to that, having done the first one, was the enormous success it brought. It ran across the Thames to South London, of course. There were people demonstrating that people from South London would cross the river and attack the people in North London, so they were from a different country. It's a bit like immigration debate and Donald Trump. It's quite incredible. We're only talking about the River Thames, God help us. But it had to be sold to people locally. And Canary Wharf was a very commercial organisation. And because Canary Wharf started with nobody living there, nobody working there, it was realised that transportation was the only way to develop a greenfield, or a brownfield in this case, commercial city, unlike London itself, which is obviously a much more historic place with a rail system in the background. So we did find that we could put together basically a base product. Now, you run your railway through certain places where developers want, and my attitude to this was, well, we'll run the railway through, but if you like a station, you better buy it because you're going to get the development around it. So we did some quite big development schemes around stations, 20 to 50 million pound worth, quite big ones, but we couldn't put the funding of the railroad directly against those, because the time you put them all together, the risk of them all coming and happening, of course, by the time you want to build a railway, it would never happen. So basically we had the base burger, and the onions and salads and tomatoes were added afterwards, although most of them were actually built in time.
One of our favorites, Antonia Malchik, joined us for episode 261 to talk about her book, A Walking Life.
Well, you explore the space of space in there, too, and you talk about the show, which I haven't seen and I want to see, The Expanse, and the people that grew up outside the planet and have to come to Earth and deal with the gravity of the world. But then it goes into the vestibular system, and there's so many good pathways in this book that I really connected to. But you explore that, what happens if we're a spacefaring race, or maybe we're not, as human because we're not connected to, this big starship that we grew up on in Earth.
Yeah, I mean, it's a huge question in science fiction that actually I really love The Expanse because it addresses it. And I kind of feel dumb, but it never occurred to me that that would be an issue. I grew up, once my family got a TV, which was, I think it was like 10, well, we had a TV before, but you can't watch anything on it. It was to plug a VCR. And so I used to watch Star Trek on this little black and white thing. And it just, growing up, it never occurred to me that, you're out in space, you're not contending with Earth's gravity, or at least you're having fake gravity most of the time. And how is that going to affect your body? And then I read this book by Dr. Joan Vernikos, who used to be with NASA, director of the Life Sciences program. And she studied astronauts for a really long time. And she talked about all the effects on their bodies of living without gravity, even for a short period of time. And it's huge. Like, the effects on our bodies are really awful if we are away from this planet. So Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos are like, let's go colonize space and go to Mars. And I'm like, yeah, how exactly? Not just the resources, but having a body that spent millions of years adapting to this one ecosystem and specific gravitational forces. And you're just going to take it out. And that's a great leap of imagination, but it's not actually all that practical or doable, especially not without thinking about it ahead of time.
Yeah, and you talk about how walking is intensely complex and how basically, like you mentioned, we've grown up on Earth for so long that we're very acutely attuned to the planet. I'm wondering if you can go into that in a little bit more detail in terms of like what it takes for somebody to actually walk.
It's just insane. Sometimes I'm walking and I'm like, this is wild. We shouldn't be able to do this at all. So there's the mechanical motion. And if you stand up and you take a step and pay attention to what your balance points are, there's this just split second where you're balancing on just like two tiny little points, or maybe three is like your big toe and the ball of your foot, maybe a pinky. And no other animal does that habitually. There are animals that move bipedally through the world, but we're the only mammals that do it by habit. Like, we have to do it. That's how we evolved. And we're the only mammals that developed that way. And then while we're doing that, which shouldn't even be possible, like that balanced motion at the speed that we do it, there's also the question of the rotation of the planet. Like, the planet has a gravitational pull itself on everything on its surface and everything within its surface, but it also has a spin. So it's moving at about 1,000 miles per hour. And our vestibular system, which are it's a little organ in your inner ear, talks to the brain and helps accommodate that. It helps you adapt to the fact that you are taking a step on a ball that's moving at 1,000 miles an hour with a gravitational pull at the center. And it's incredible. And, obviously other animals do it, but mostly on all fours. And we do it with these two pegs, basically, that should not be able to move that way, especially with all the forces acting on them from the outside. And it's pretty miraculous, actually.
There's so many bones in our feet. There's so many muscles that do certain things. It is really quite amazing. I learned this actually maybe about a decade ago. I had some vertigo, and I never really learned where it came from and why it disappeared, but I had it for several years. And it's actually one of the reasons why I started blogging more on the Overhead Wire, because I was stuck inside and I couldn't do anything. Or I didn't know when it was going to hit me, the vertigo. And so it's pretty intense, not just physically, but mentally intense, in that you don't know when it's going to hit you. And so you're afraid to move, and you're afraid to go places. You're afraid to go out with your friends because you're not sure if you're going to have to, leave without notice, just to say, oh my gosh, this is hitting me, I got to go. And so it's very odd sensation. And, reading this book actually brought me back to that time, not in a bad way, but in a good way, in terms of thinking about, what that means to me to be able to move around. And I imagine that, from writing this book, you had those thoughts too of like, how amazing it is to just be able to walk.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. And I've never had long-term vertigo, but the town I live in is Whitefish in Montana, and it's a little ski mountain. So there's a ski hill here, and I ski, and I take my kids up there, but it gets foggy all the time. So, everyone come ski here. It's beautiful. You don't have to move stay, because it's foggy in the winter a lot. And I have frequently gotten vertigo when I've been up at the top, like up at the summit. And, you literally cannot tell what's up and what's down, what's ground and what's the sky. And I'll try to find someone with a really bright jacket and follow them down. And then I just have to leave because I feel so sick. And I've had it last like 24 hours before. Whoa. And so, I have a tiny sense of what you're talking about. And to know that that would hit you at any time for no reason, like, I would be scared to move around because, if anyone's ever had a concussion, knocked their head, or gotten disoriented, you know what that feels like, and you cannot move through the world if it's like that because your body can't stay upright. It can't move forward. That same magazine where I did the End of Walking, Aeon, AEON, they did an essay several years ago about someone who has long-term vertigo. And she likes to have a go at the question of, you've got to get balance back in your life. And, which we speak of metaphorically, but she's like, I want to punch people who say that. I don't think she actually wrote that, but
Right.
that's the kind of sense you get from it. But, reading her long essay about that experience really made me think more about it too. Because I was like, man, if your inner ear is not really talking with your brain and with the world outside of you, you can be really stuck.
Germaine Halugwa joined episode 285 to talk about her book, The Digital City.
I want to go back to something you said earlier about, just a general theme, the scariness of these smart city applications. And I also noticed a theme that I'm wondering if you noticed as well. There's a kind of a theme that perhaps maybe you intended in the book, but I'm curious if you meant it, of extraction. People in Kansas City felt like Google was just trying to extract money from them. The smart cities are exploiting people for data. Placemaking efforts are for other people. Was that something that came to your mind when you were writing this kind of general theme of extraction from people to companies to corporations to the people that aren't necessarily in your corner?
Yeah, I mean, I think, yes. Short answer is that I wasn't maybe thinking about extraction in that particular terminology or in that particular way, but I was definitely thinking about exchange, and exchange is exploitative. So the idea that you're giving something and you might not be compensated for it in a way that's beneficial to you. So that idea of citizen as censor would be extraction, as you're saying, but also an exchange that's unequal, that you might be giving sort of your biosigns or your mobility patterns or your purchasing record to an entity not of your choosing, and they're gaining a lot more value and benefit, or a different sort of value and benefit, than what they're giving back to you. So I was thinking a lot about feedback loops and sort of inequity within these feedback loops. And we can think about it as extraction, but there's always something productive about extraction, which ends up kind of going back to the individual or not, in a, kind of equitable way or not. And so I was thinking, I guess, instead of extraction, the way I was thinking about it was equity and inequity. But I think we're thinking about the same thing here, right? We could call it exploitation. You could call it extraction. You could also call it neoliberalism, which some of the reviewers of the book were kind of saying, well, aren't you just talking about market economies? Aren't you just talking about the logic of advanced capitalism? And I think that in some ways, yes. Depending on who you are and where you are positioned in sort of urban hierarchies, there's lots of different terms, but I think that relationship that you're identifying is definitely one way to put it, definitely a theme throughout the entire book.
Yeah, I think it was most prevalent in Kansas City, and the discussion about the people who felt left out of the Google Fiber application, as it were. I'm curious if you could tell listeners a little bit more about that and kind of what you learned from that experience about people that don't feel included, or, how digital literacy it does or doesn't happen over time.
Yeah, so the Kansas City Google Fiber, I guess we could call it an experiment or project or initiative. It coincided with my move to the Kansas area. So I don't live in Kansas City. I live maybe 45 minutes away. But when I first moved here in 2011, it was 1 year after Google had announced that they were going to build this experimental gigabit fiber network in some city in the US. And there was a big contest. I don't know if you remember it at all, in 2010, where different cities were competing for Google's favor, essentially, the sort of privilege of being a gigabit fiber networked city. And in 2011, when I moved to this area, Kansas City, Kansas, and then a little bit later, Kansas City, Missouri as well, were selected as the winning cities. So they were going to be the cities to host this experimental fiber network. And then in 2012, something really interesting happened. I thought it was really interesting that the way that different neighborhoods were going to acquire Google Fiber service was through a participatory model for infrastructure deployment. So they had to gather their neighbors together and they had to pay a registration fee to sign up to hit a critical mass to get this fiber optic network in their neighborhood. And then after they were kind of considered a fiberhood. After they reached that critical mass, then that neighborhood then could sign up and pay whatever fees were, kind of required to subscribe in order to subscribe to the service. So one of the things that happened around 2012, after the first round of those subscriptions, or the first round of the participatory model came back, Google was putting on their website maps of which neighborhoods qualified for service and which did not. And one of the striking things about these maps, even to me, who had only lived in this area for a short amount of time, was that the maps coincided with not only digital haves and have-nots, if we want to put it in those digital divide terms, but also poverty levels, education levels. So what we saw was to the east of this avenue called Troost Avenue, which was colloquially kind of referred to as the Troost Wall, or a dividing line. It's like a racial economic dividing line that has been historically inscribed for decades, where to the east you see slightly lower income neighborhoods, majority African American neighborhoods who have always had a difficult time with institutionalized racism against home ownership, a lot of renters. And then on the west side, you see a lot of the opposite, sort of homeowners, people of privileged. And what you saw on these maps was that on the east side, you had people that didn't meet the qualifications, and on the west side, you did. So what you saw was these sort of patterns of inequity being reinscribed through digital connection, that the privileged or the networked people who are already privileged, already valued, already networked within urban environments, were becoming more so. And those who were not, did not enjoy those sort of pre-existing privileges, were not necessarily falling by the wayside, but not signing up for what was deemed, at least by the company and municipal officials, to be this really beneficial service to acquire. So I started digging into, well, why didn't people who were living on the east side of Troost Avenue sign up for what seemed to be a pretty affordable internet connection, higher speeds than they were getting before, if they were getting any sort of internet connection at home before. And I was curious about what factors other than cost or digital literacy went into making those decisions. And also, one of the things that I kept seeing repeated in Pew Internet Research surveys, and also surveys that Google and Kansas City were conducting about relevance. So this idea that, well, infrastructure, high-speed digital connection wasn't seen as relevant to people who were lower income, who were lacking in digital literacy. And I kind of questioned that a lot. I didn't think that was necessarily true. And I found that people who didn't sign up did see that this Google Fiber connection or having high-speed internet connection was really beneficial. They just saw that the way that this infrastructure was being deployed, how it was being sold, and how it was being designed and implemented was not for them. So I talked to people. I went to a lot of digital inclusion meetings. I went to cabinet meetings. I met with representatives from Google Fiber in the Kansas City area. And I really kind of wanted to know more about how people in underserved communities chose to subscribe to a gigabit fiber network or not, and how their decision to subscribe at all might have been shaped by how they navigated or negotiated geographies and experiences within the city. So I think that Kansas City chapter is a really good example of not only kind of what I think I mentioned earlier in terms of how things like community or neighborhood or participation can signal inclusivity, but are kind of ambiguous and can be used to mask exclusion. But I think also it's a really good example of how something that seems neutral and almost invisible, like digital media infrastructure, the wires and the cables, is actually laden with a lot of questions and concerns about equitable design and equitable deployment.
I was also interested in the definition that people came up with of home and of community, and how the digital infrastructure was sold as something that, one per household kind of thing, almost like a rationing. Whereas there's a lot of folks in the community that felt like, well, that's not how we see home, or that's not how we see community. And so there was a disconnect, which was really interesting to me.
Yeah, and I don't know that people would have maybe articulated that, or that relationship would have been so observable if they weren't reacting to the presence of a digital media opportunity or technology, right? So I think that one of the arguments in the book is that if we take understandings and experiences of place as central to understanding our relationships with digital media, we'll learn a lot more about both digital media and our relationships to place. And I think what you mentioned is a really good example of that, that because the policy around this infrastructure implementation was that you could only have one connection to a single household, and it wasn't a wireless connection, it was a fiber to the home connection. So it was very static, very stable connection, but it was per one household. And that household was not envisioned as an apartment building. It was envisioned as a single family home that was a standalone entity. And if we look at who owns these single family home as a standalone entity, it's not everybody in the city. It's a particular population. So there's some inequity built into that as well. But I think just envisioning home, envisioning community, envisioning neighborhood was something, they're all place-based relationships. And it was something that the implementation of a fiber network really brought to the fore, that not everybody sees home, mobility, community, neighborhood in the same way.
And finally, Dr. Mindy Fullilove joined episode 330 and discussed root shock with us.
How is the psychology of a place connected to the physical of a place?
Well, the psychology of the place is in the people's heads. So the physical of the place is outside. So a place, the geographers particularly have said, is a bounded bit of space. So space is everything. Then there are little bits of it that have a boundary. So the room you're in, the room I'm in, these are places. But the room you're in is in a building, the room I'm in is a building, and then the building is somewhere. So all of those are places once you've set the boundary. So when you're thinking about place, you have to think about the boundary. And then obviously there are within any boundary, like within a house, there are rooms in a house or apartments in apartment buildings, etc. So there are lots of little places beside each other. Even if I'm in the state of New Jersey, there's 49 other states. So it gets to be complicated because I have to think about, wait, my place is located at such a place, but there are parallel places, almost like parallel universes. And in place, once you set the boundary, everything inside that is the place. So all the physical, all the social, all the psychological is part of what's going on. It's very complicated.
Yeah, it's now you got me thinking now about all of these parallel universes that are happening. Well, I've often thought about that in terms of, we operate in our spaces, in our neighborhoods, in our homes. And I often think, oh, well, and you go and visit another space. And it's kind of strange to think about this space operates as it does every day, daily, but I'm not here. I'm in another place, but this is operating and I have no recollection or understanding of what's going on there. And so it's kind of something interesting to think. It's almost like an out-of-body experience to a certain extent. You go somewhere and you're like, this place exists all the time, but I don't experience it all the time.
Yeah, I agree.
I want to step back a little bit to your previous work. We're going to talk a little bit about Main Street, which is your most recent book, but I want to ask you about root shock because I think it's a really important kind of precedent to what we're going to talk about today. What brought you to write the book, and what is root shock, I guess, for folks that might not know about it?
But if we start with the other question first, we'll arrive at what is root shock. So I was studying the psychology of place, and so psychiatry is about disorder and illness. So I was very interested in things that had made people ill. But one of the ways I studied was to just ask people about their experiences of place, their stories. But a set of stories that came up over and over again were stories of people who'd been displaced by urban renewal, which was a program in the US in the 50s and 60s. Two people were particularly important in helping me understand urban renewal. One was David Jenkins, who had been displaced from his community at age 11. And the other was Mary Bishop, a journalist who'd written about urban renewal in Roanoke, Virginia. So they really were the people who oriented me to what had happened in urban renewal. And it was such a big experience. And it seemed to me it was like pulling a plant out of the ground. And gardeners have a term for what can happen to a plant if you just yank it out of the ground, because it tears the roots. And it can go into shock, and they call that root shock. And it seemed to me that what had happened to people who'd been rudely displaced from their homes was this kind of experience of root shock. And, it was unsettling. It disturbed their growth. Some people got settled again, but some people couldn't, and they died. So it was root shock that really became the image that I had for the massive disruption that this causes in people's lives.
Yeah, and it seems like it's akin to brain damage to a certain extent. Recently, we had a discussion with Andres Sevstuk about weak ties and connecting people and jobs to commerce. He was on a show a couple of weeks ago. And after reading your book, I felt like it's much more than that. It feels like these disruptions of weak ties through the urban renewal, through dispersal tactics, are akin to this brain damage. Why is it that these weak ties are so much more important than maybe, many of us understood before?
People talk about it. And in fact, Mark Granovetter, who's one of the sociologists who really described weak ties, talked about it really as paradox. The strength of weak ties is the title of his classic article. Why would weak ties be what's strong? But in a society, strong ties actually are what make us weak, and weak ties are what make us strong. So that's the paradox. So the strong ties are the ties of, like, we share religion, or we share race, or we share neighborhood. Those are strong ties. But weak ties are like the guy you're on a nodding acquaintance with at the local convenience store. And you don't know his name, you've never been to his house, but he knows you're part of the neighborhood. And if you were, during checkout complaining that, it's hard to get somebody to shovel your sidewalk, he would know somebody who was looking for work, and he would say, I'll send somebody by. You could hire that person to shovel your sidewalk. That's a weak tie. And it's those, because they bridge communities, bridge groups of strong ties, that make society strong. So when you do urban renewal or something like that, you damage the way society functions. Now, societies have to work, people have to work together because they constantly have to solve problems. Whatever was going on yesterday created today, but today is new issues. For us personally, for us as families, there's always new issues. It's like when your kid is a toddler, you can't get him to take a bath or go to bed. But when your kid is a teenager, you can't get him to take a bath or go to bed. But it's different issues. You have to have different strategies. You have to keep up with the kid. So the kid changes every day, and you got to have new strategies every day. So the families have to be able to do problem solving. Same with societies. They have to problem solve for today. But if you've broken all the weak ties, you can't have a good conversation. So society can't solve its problems. And that's where U.S. society is right now. We've broken the weak ties, and we can't have good conversations, and we can't solve our problems.
What's the main way that we've broken weak ties?
It's not a main way. It's that we keep uprooting communities over and over. So urban renewal in the 50s, there was a program called Planned Shrinkage, which was disinvestment, deindustrialization, where we just knocked the economy out from all of our industrial cities. So it's multiple programs over time. Think about COVID. All the people who have lost their jobs, and their jobs may not come back, and they're facing eviction because we've hardly had any disaster relief for people. So they have to move because at some points they said 40 million people were at risk of eviction in the United States. Well, move 40 million people and see what happens to your society. It's pretty devastating.
All right, that's all 13. We'll see you next week, episode 401. All right, that's the end. Thanks for joining us. Talking Headways is a project of the Overhead Wire and found at Streetsblog USA first. Thanks to our generous Patreon supporters. You guys are awesome and support the show every week. Go to patreon.com/theoverheadwire. Get yourself a transportation scarf. Go to theoverheadwire.com and get yourself a transportation scarf. bit.ly/cars are cholesterol. Get yourself a shirt. We appreciate you guys doing that. You can sign up for the Overhead Wire daily newsletter. I've been doing it since 2006. Go to theoverheadwire.com and sign up for a free 2-week trial. No credit cards. Just your email address is required. And you can find this podcast wherever you get your podcasts, including iHeartRadio, Spotify, Stitcher, Overcast, and of course, Apple Podcasts if it's working. Thanks to everybody who comes back each week. We really appreciate that. And wow, we made it to 400. Can you believe it? I can. The next 100 are going to be a blast, and I can't wait to share them with you all. Thanks to everybody, especially Streetsblog, for letting me to continue to do this show. Sometimes we talk about things that are transportation adjacent, but I think that makes life a little bit richer. So thanks to everybody. And we'll see you again for episode 401 next week. We'll see you also next time at Talking Headways. See you later. Have a good one. Happy 400.